What would you do if the person you loved most in the world stopped breathing, and your mind simply refused to accept it? Margaret Foster asked herself this question every single day, though the answer had already consumed her entire existence. The afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows of the old Victorian house, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that creaked with every step she took. She moved methodically through the hallway, carrying a tray with carefully prepared lunch, peanut butter and jelly sandwich cut into perfect triangles, apple slices arranged in a fan, and a glass of milk with exactly 3 ice cubes, just the way Emily liked it. "Sweetheart, I'm coming up," Margaret called softly, her voice echoing through the empty house with an eerie gentleness that would have unsettled anyone who heard it. But there was no one to hear, no one except Margaret, and the silence that had become her only companion in the weeks since that terrible afternoon when everything changed. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step a ritual she had performed countless times, her fingers trailing along the banister worn smooth by generations of hands before hers. The second floor smelled of lavender and something else, something she had learned to ignore, something she told herself was just the old house settling into its bones. Margaret paused at Emily's bedroom door, painted a cheerful yellow that now seemed to mock the darkness that had crept into their lives. She knocked gently, 3 soft taps, and waited. "Emily, honey, I have your favorite lunch," she whispered, pressing her ear against the door as if listening for a response she knew would never come, yet hoped for with every fiber of her being. When Margaret pushed the door open, the room looked exactly as it had that morning when she'd straightened the covers and adjusted the pillows. Immaculate, perfect, frozen in time like a museum exhibit dedicated to childhood. Emily's stuffed animals sat arranged on the window seat, watching with their button eyes. The piano in the corner stood silent, its ivory keys untouched, waiting for small fingers that would never play again. And there in the bed beneath layers of carefully tucked blankets and quilts lay the shape that Margaret's mind insisted was her sleeping daughter. "I made your favorites, sweetheart," Margaret continued, setting the tray on the nightstand beside the bed, next to the framed photograph of Emily's last recital, her smile bright and alive, her eyes sparkling with the joy that had once filled this house. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb, her hand reaching out to smooth invisible wrinkles from the comforter. Her fingers trembled slightly, a tremor she attributed to exhaustion rather than the truth her subconscious knew but refused to acknowledge. Outside, a car drove past, its engine a distant rumble that reminded Margaret of the world beyond these walls, the world she had methodically shut out piece by piece, excuse by excuse. She had stopped answering the phone 2 weeks ago, stopped checking emails, told the school that Emily had developed a severe case of pneumonia and needed complete isolation to recover. The lies came easier now, flowing from her tongue with practiced smoothness, each fabrication another brick in the wall she was building between reality and the sanctuary of her delusion. Margaret leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper as if sharing a secret. "They called again today, the school. That woman from social services too. But don't worry, baby. I won't let anyone take you away from me. Never again. I'll protect you this time, I promise." Her eyes ringed with dark circles from sleepless nights, glistened with unshed tears as she gazed at the still form beneath the covers. Somewhere deep in the fractured landscape of her mind, a voice screamed the truth she couldn't face, but Margaret had become expert at silencing that voice, drowning it in ritual and routine and the desperate, overwhelming need to believe that love alone could reverse the irreversible. Detective Sarah Chen sat in her unmarked sedan across the street from the Foster house, watching the windows for any sign of movement behind those perpetually drawn curtains. 3 weeks of unanswered calls, missed appointments, and increasingly bizarre excuses had brought her to this point, parked in the fading afternoon light with a growing knot of dread in her stomach. She had been a detective for 8 years, had seen her share of tragedy and deception, but something about this case felt different, felt wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. The house itself seemed to emanate an atmosphere of wrongness, the overgrown lawn, the newspapers piling up on the porch despite Margaret's insistence that everything was fine, the way the windows remained dark even as evening approached. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through the incident reports again, reading between the lines of what wasn't being said. The school nurse had been the first to call, concerned when Emily Foster hadn't returned after Thanksgiving break. Then came the call from Pastor Coleman at St. Michael's Church, his voice uncertain but worried, mentioning that Margaret had seemed not herself during their last conversation, talking about keeping Emily safe from invisible dangers. Most recently, Rebecca Hayes, the social worker assigned to do a wellness check, had filed a complaint stating that Margaret had refused entry to the home, claimed Emily was contagious, and had become agitated and hostile when pressed for details. Sarah knew the signs. She'd worked enough cases involving grief, mental breakdown, and denial, but knowing didn't make the waiting any easier. She tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, debating whether to approach the house now or wait for the warrant she'd requested that morning. In her gut, she knew time was critical, but procedure existed for a reason, and Sarah had learned the hard way that cutting corners could destroy a case before it even began. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a text from her partner, Marcus. Judge signed the warrant, moving up timeline to tomorrow, 8 a.m., bringing backup and psych eval team. Sarah read the message twice, relief mixing with apprehension. Tomorrow they would know the truth, whatever it was, and somehow that certainty felt heavier than the uncertainty she'd been carrying. She was about to start her car when movement caught her eye, a shadow passing behind the upstairs window, quick and furtive, followed by the faint glow of candlelight. Sarah grabbed her binoculars from the passenger seat, focusing on the second-floor window, the one she'd determined must be Emily's bedroom, based on the cheerful yellow paint visible through the gaps in the curtains. For several long minutes she saw nothing. Then the curtain shifted slightly, and Margaret Foster's face appeared, gaunt and pale in the dim light, her eyes scanning the street below with paranoid intensity. Sarah instinctively slumped lower in her seat, though she knew her car was too far away and too ordinary to draw specific attention. She watched as Margaret's lips moved, clearly talking to someone inside the room, her expression shifting between tenderness and something that looked disturbingly like anguish. Who was she talking to? If Emily was truly sick, wouldn't there be doctor's visits, pharmacy runs, some evidence of medical care? Sarah had checked. No prescriptions filled in the past month, no insurance claims submitted, no ambulance calls to the address. It was as if Emily Foster had simply vanished from existence, and her mother was pretending nothing had changed. Sarah made a decision then, pulling out her notebook and writing down every detail she could observe. The time, the lighting in the window, Margaret's appearance and behavior, the absolute absence of any sign that a sick child was being properly cared for inside that house. Tomorrow morning couldn't come fast enough, yet Sarah found herself dreading what they would find when they finally breached those doors. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now, every instinct was screaming that whatever was happening inside the Foster house, it was far worse than anyone imagined. Margaret stood at the window long after the suspicious car had driven away, her heart pounding against her ribcage, like a trapped bird, desperate to escape. They were coming closer, circling like vultures, and she could feel the walls of her sanctuary beginning to crack under the pressure of their questions and their concern, and their terrible, invasive need to know. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned to face Emily's bed, her breathing shallow and rapid. "They want to take you away from me, sweetheart," she whispered, wringing her hands together until the knuckles turned white. "But I won't let them. I couldn't protect you before, couldn't save you when you needed me most, but I can protect you now." The memory of that afternoon 3 weeks ago crashed over her like a wave she could never quite escape, no matter how hard she tried to push it down into the dark places of her mind. She had only been gone 40 minutes, maybe less, rushing to the pharmacy 3 towns over, because the local one had been out of Emily's inhaler refills. 40 minutes that had stretched into an eternity of what-ifs and if-onlys that haunted every waking moment and invaded her dreams with vicious clarity. When she had returned, the house had been too quiet, that particular quality of silence that speaks of absence rather than peace, and she had known, somewhere in the primal part of her brain that understood loss, that something was catastrophically wrong. Margaret shook her head violently, as if the physical motion could dislodge the memories she couldn't bear to fully acknowledge. Instead, she focused on the present, on the rituals that kept her grounded in the reality she had constructed. She moved to the nightstand and carefully lit 3 candles, their flames casting dancing shadows across the walls covered in Emily's artwork, finger paintings from kindergarten, a watercolor sunset from 3rd grade, a pencil sketch of a bird that her teacher had praised profusely. "Time for your evening medicine, baby," Margaret said softly, opening the drawer where she kept an array of bottles and vials, most of them empty now but maintained as part of the routine. She went through the motions of preparing medications that would never be administered, pouring exact dosages into small cups, checking temperatures on thermometers that always read normal, recording symptoms in a journal filled with fabricated observations. The act of caring, the performance of motherhood, had become more real to her than reality itself. Margaret sat beside the bed and began to read aloud from Emily's favorite book, her voice steady and warm despite the tremor in her hands. She read about magical kingdoms and brave princesses, about adventures and happy endings, her mind splitting into fragments that both believed and knew the truth simultaneously. In her more lucid moments, usually in the darkest hours before dawn, Margaret would feel the full weight of what she had done pressing down on her chest until she couldn't breathe, until she wanted to scream and confess and beg for forgiveness from a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. But then morning would come, and with it the desperate need to maintain the illusion, to protect Emily from a world that had already taken her father and now wanted to take her too. The room had grown colder as night fell, and Margaret pulled an additional blanket from the closet, tucking it carefully around the still form in the bed. "I've been researching, Emily," she continued, her voice taking on an edge of manic excitement. "There are ways, ancient ways, to preserve what we love. The Egyptians knew, the saints knew. Love is stronger than death, isn't it? It has to be." She pulled out a leather-bound journal filled with her increasingly erratic handwriting, sketches copied from forbidden books she'd found in the darker corners of the internet, prayers in languages she didn't understand, but repeated with desperate fervor. Somewhere in the house a floorboard creaked, and Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear and something darker, something that might have been madness or might have been the last desperate stand of a mother who had already lost everything and refused to lose anything more. Rebecca Hayes had made a terrible mistake, and now she was paying for it, with every breath that came harder than the last in the suffocating darkness of Margaret Foster's basement. 2 days ago, she had knocked on that door with her clipboard and her professional concern and her absolute certainty that she could handle whatever situation awaited her inside. She had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and now her wrists ached from the zip ties cutting into her skin. Her throat was raw from screaming into the gag that Margaret had fashioned from what looked like a child's scarf, and her mind raced with the horrifying realization that she might die in this basement without anyone knowing what had happened to her. The visit had started normally enough. Margaret had actually answered the door this time, looking disheveled but relatively coherent, apologizing for the previous cancellations and inviting Rebecca inside with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Rebecca had felt a flutter of unease, but had pushed it down, telling herself she was being paranoid, that Margaret was just a grieving widow struggling to cope with a sick child. But the moment she had stepped across the threshold, she had smelled it. The sickly sweet odor of decay poorly masked by an overwhelming assault of air fresheners, candles and potpourri that made her eyes water. "I'd like to see Emily," Rebecca had said carefully, watching Margaret's face for any sign of the reaction she knew was coming. Margaret's expression had shifted then, like a mask slipping, revealing something wild and dangerous underneath. "She's sleeping," Margaret had replied, her voice taking on a strange sing-song quality. "The doctors say she needs complete rest. No visitors, no disturbances." Rebecca had pressed harder, citing regulations and child welfare concerns, and that's when Margaret's composure had shattered completely. What happened next was a blur of violence that Rebecca's mind couldn't quite process. Margaret moving with shocking speed, something heavy connecting with the side of her head, the world tilting sideways as she fell, and then the dragging sensation as she was pulled downstairs she hadn't even known existed. Now in the darkness, Rebecca could hear Margaret's footsteps above her, pacing back and forth, talking to herself or to Emily, or to ghosts that existed only in her fractured mind. "They're trying to separate us," Margaret's voice filtered through the floorboards, muffled but audible in the terrible silence of the basement. "They don't understand that a mother's love transcends everything, even death itself, especially death." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face, mixing with the blood from the wound on her temple. She had a daughter of her own, 7 years old, waiting at home with a babysitter who thought Rebecca would be back by dinner. How long before someone realized she was missing? How long before they connected her disappearance to this house, to this case? She had been careful about her notes, about documenting everything, but had she been careful enough? Above her, Margaret's voice continued, rising and falling in what sounded like prayer or incantation, and Rebecca felt a new wave of terror wash over her as she realized that Margaret wasn't just mentally ill. She had crossed into territory far darker, into obsession and delusion so complete that reality no longer had any hold on her. Rebecca tried to work her hands free from the zip ties, ignoring the burning pain as the plastic cut deeper into her wrists. She had to escape, had to get help, not just for herself, but for whatever remained of Emily Foster upstairs. The thought of what she might find when the police finally came made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to focus on survival, on the small sounds and movements that might give her some advantage. In the corner of the basement, something scurried across the floor, and Rebecca bit back a sob of fear and frustration. She had always believed in the fundamental goodness of people, in the power of compassion and intervention to heal even the deepest wounds. But now, trapped in this nightmare, she was being forced to confront the truth that sometimes love itself could become the most dangerous force of all, especially when twisted by grief into something unrecognizable and monstrous. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the house like a gunshot as Detective Sarah Chen and her team breached the front door at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, their warrant clutched in one hand and their weapons drawn in the other. Sarah had prepared herself for what they might find, had steeled her nerves with the cold professionalism that came from years of dealing with humanity's darkest moments, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the assault on her senses the moment she stepped into Margaret Foster's home. The smell hit them first, a nauseating combination of decay and chemical preservatives and floral air fresheners all battling for dominance in the stale air, causing several officers to gag and reach for the masks they'd brought as a precaution. "Margaret Foster, this is the police," Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the shocked silence that followed their entry. "We have a warrant to search the premises and to perform a welfare check on Emily Foster. Please show yourself immediately." For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened, and then they heard it, a sound so heartbreaking and terrible that it would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come. The sound of a woman sobbing upstairs, interspersed with words that made no sense, a litany of desperate pleas and protective promises directed at someone who couldn't possibly respond. Sarah gestured for half the team to search the ground floor while she led the others upstairs, each step revealing new horrors in the form of bizarre shrines built throughout the house, photographs of Emily surrounded by candles, children's drawings taped obsessively to every wall, and handwritten notes containing prayers and incantations that spoke of resurrection and eternal protection. The door to Emily's bedroom stood ajar, and Sarah could see candlelight flickering from within, casting dancing shadows that seemed almost alive in their movement. She pushed the door open slowly, her weapon raised, and the scene that greeted her would be seared into her memory forever. Margaret Foster sat on the floor beside a child's bed, her arms wrapped around a bundle of blankets, rocking back and forth with the gentle motion of a mother comforting an infant. Her hair hung in matted tangles around her face, her clothes were stained and torn, and her eyes, when she finally looked up at the intruders, held the vacant, shattered quality of someone who had left sanity far behind. "Oh, you can't take her," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I won't let you take her again. I failed her once. I failed them both, but not this time. Not ever again." Sarah felt her heart breaking, even as her training kicked in, recognizing the extreme psychological break she was witnessing. "Margaret, we're here to help. We're not going to hurt Emily. We just need to see that she's okay." At those words, something shifted in Margaret's expression, a flicker of the lucidity she'd been desperately suppressing, and her grip on the blankets loosened slightly. "She's not okay," Margaret said, and for the first time her voice carried the weight of truth she'd been denying. "She's been not okay for 23 days, but I couldn't let her go." "How do you let go of half your soul?" One of the officers moved closer, and Margaret's arms tightened again protectively, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. She holstered her weapon and knelt down a few feet from Margaret, making herself vulnerable in a calculated gesture of trust. "Margaret, I know you love Emily more than anything in this world. I know you've been trying to protect her, but the best way to protect her now is to let us help. Can you do that? Can you let us help Emily?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she looked down at the bundle in her arms, and when she finally pulled back the blankets, revealing what lay beneath, the collective gasp from the officers filled the room. There, preserved through methods Sarah didn't want to contemplate, lay Emily Foster, her small body dressed in her favorite pajamas, her hair brushed and arranged with meticulous care, looking for all the world like she might simply be sleeping, if not for the unmistakable stillness that spoke of death's irreversible claim. 6 months later, Margaret Foster sat in the common room of Riverside Psychiatric Hospital, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she stared out the window at the garden below, where other patients walked in supervised circles under the watchful eyes of orderlies. The medication had cleared much of the fog from her mind, bringing with it a clarity that was both a blessing and a curse, forcing her to confront the full weight of what she had done in those dark weeks when grief had consumed her completely. Dr. Patricia Morrison sat across from her, clipboard in hand, watching Margaret with the careful attention she gave all her patients, but with a particular gentleness reserved for those whose stories broke even the most hardened professional hearts. "Tell me about Emily today," Dr. Morrison said softly, a weekly ritual that had become the cornerstone of Margaret's therapy. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away from the window. "Today I can remember her alive," she whispered. "Not the way I kept her, but truly alive. I can hear her laughing when she played her piano, see her dancing in the kitchen while I made dinner, feel her arms around my neck when she told me she loved me. For so long I could only see her still and silent, but today I can remember the light in her eyes." The breakthrough had been gradual, emerging through months of intensive therapy, medication adjustments, and the painstaking work of helping Margaret's fractured psyche reassemble itself into something that could bear the unbearable truth. They had discovered the depth of her untreated PTSD from her husband's death, the complicated grief that had never been processed, and the way Emily's sudden death had triggered a complete psychological break that manifested as an elaborate delusion of protection. Rebecca Hayes had survived her ordeal in the basement, physically intact, but carrying scars that therapy was slowly helping her heal, and though she had every right to hate Margaret, she had instead become an unlikely advocate for mental health awareness, speaking publicly about how the system had failed to recognize and intervene in Margaret's deteriorating condition. Pastor Coleman visited Margaret once a month, sitting with her in silence sometimes, praying with her others, helping her navigate the complicated terrain of faith after tragedy. He carried his own burden of guilt for not acting sooner, for mistaking Margaret's decline for simple grief rather than the dangerous spiral it had become. The legal proceedings had been complex and heartbreaking. Margaret had been found not guilty by reason of insanity, a verdict that brought no satisfaction to anyone, but acknowledged the reality that the woman who had committed those acts was not the same woman who now sat in therapy trying to piece together a shattered life. Emily had been buried beside her father in a small ceremony that Margaret had not been well enough to attend, but she kept a photograph of their headstones beside her bed now, a daily reminder of the reality she had spent so long denying. "I loved her so much it destroyed me," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "I thought love meant never letting go, never accepting loss, fighting death itself if I had to. But love isn't holding on when you should release. Real love is honoring someone's memory by living, by healing, by allowing grief to transform into something that doesn't consume everything in its path." Dr. Morrison nodded, making notes but mostly just listening, bearing witness to Margaret's painful journey back to sanity. "What do you think Emily would want you to do now?" she asked. Margaret closed her eyes, and for a moment she could almost feel her daughter's presence, not the preserved corpse she had clung to in her madness, but the vital, joyful spirit of the girl who had filled her life with music and laughter. "She'd want me to forgive myself," Margaret said, opening her eyes to meet Dr. Morrison's gaze. "She'd want me to remember her with joy, instead of this crushing guilt. She'd want me to understand that what happened to her wasn't my fault, and what I did afterward was sickness, not love." In her room that night, Margaret lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of the hospital around her, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she might one day leave this place, where she might find a way to live with her grief instead of being destroyed by it, where she might honor Emily's memory, not by holding her corpse, but by keeping her spirit alive in the music and laughter and love they had shared. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain and filled with pain she would carry forever, Margaret finally understood that this was what protection truly meant, not refusing to let go, but learning how to say goodbye.